Welcome once again to the South African Government Auditors podcast. And today we are reviewing the budget with specific focus on the tax elements of the budget and issues that arise from there. And that is why I've got the experts with me. Right, Liz Fick is in charge of tax and fiduciary at Investec. She's our guest here. And Vishal Patel is with the Auditor General. And welcome to both of you. Let's look at the makeup of the budget from a tax perspective, Liz, and we'll drill into the issues in a moment.
Yeah. So Tim, it's actually nothing surprising happened in the budget. We kind of knew, thanks to the debacle that there was, where it got kicked out. We thought it was happening, and then it didn't actually happen. So we knew there was probably going to be some kind of a VAT increase, and in fact, it wasn't a surprise either. There has been some murmurings and talk about a VAT increase for a while. So apart from the VAT increases, there wasn't really much that further changed from a tax perspective in the budget. So it was pretty uneventful in that regard. We also see a little bit of bracket creep coming in, which we have seen previous years as well. So no surprise there either. Interestingly, though, I was expecting to see some changes as a result of a recent court case, the coronation case, which was a tax case that we saw, particularly on CFCs, controlled foreign companies. And we thought we might see some specific legislation coming in to try and close some loopholes. As you know, SARS lost that case. And we actually didn't see anything coming in there.
Let me interrupt, if you don't mind, for a while. So you mentioned the coronation case. Just bring us up to speed on that one.
Yes. So essentially, there's a section of our Act that specifically targets controlled foreign companies, and that's where a company is owned by more than 50% South African residents. And essentially what that has is the effect of turning companies transparent for a tax perspective. So if a South African resident or South African company owns a foreign company and it's more than 50%, then any income and gain in that company is actually taxable in the hands of the South African resident. Now, this was relevant for Coronation because they had various subsidiaries. There are certain exemptions where, and we call it the Foreign Business Establishment Exemption, the FBE exemption. And essentially what that exemption is that if you've got actual bums on seats, so you've got a real office, you've got phones, there are laptops, there's people there, there's an exemption from these CFC provisions. And a lot of the court case was about whether or not that FBE, the Foreign Business Establishment Exemption, would apply to Coronation. And essentially, they determined that it wouldn't, and that the exemption would apply to Coronation, and SARS lost the case. They wanted to attribute all that income again back into Coronation in South Africa.
All right, let's break down the budget now into different tax groups. I know that there's income element to it, there's corporate taxes, there's VAT and others. Tell me more about the makeup.
So what was interesting is that our Minister of Finance mentioned that they looked at potentially increasing corporate tax rates, which would have actually been really surprising if it had come in. But when doing the analysis, they realized that our corporate tax rates are really quite high if you look at if you compare us to global corporate tax rates. And on top of that, to strip a dividend out of a company or to extract a dividend out of a company, there's a further dividend withholding tax, which is 20%, which is also above the global norm. So our corporate tax rates are already high enough. So they didn't actually bring in a further corporate tax increase, which also would have been surprising if they had, because we've just seen the corporate tax rates coming down. I mean, it wasn't anything major. It was with 1%. So it's currently at 27%. So we didn't see any movement on the corporate space. Income tax rates, we mentioned the bracket creep. We didn't see any brackets moving or adjusting for inflation. So that has the effect of bracket creep, what's known as bracket creep, which essentially means that your income increases with inflation, but the tax rates don't adjust with inflation. So you might push certain individuals actually into a higher tax bracket, even though technically they're not earning more.
Well, Vishal, for you, what stood out in the budget from a tax perspective?
Well, for me, when you have a look at the VAT one, we're increasing 1% over 2 years, so 0.5% this year, 0.5% next year. But it seemed as though the Minister of Finance actually tried to mitigate that. I mean, he expanded on the VAT zero rated food items, he increased social grants to try to offset that. And if you look at even the fuel levy itself, he's not really increasing that. So if you look at the people who would actually suffer the most from the VAT increase, it would be the people on the lower end of the market. So this would be actually a situation whereby by balancing it out, he actually tried to actually assist them in actually sorting that one. The other thing is that the social spending, our primary budget surplus was 0.5. Now we're actually trying to make 0.9 and try to stabilize government debt. It was great to see that ESCOM actually has some debt relief with regards to from 70 billion to 50 billion, saving 20 billion for us. And then the public sector wages. As a lot people always talk about public sector wages and what actually happens, but we all know that when it comes to June, July, when it actually comes into play, then we'll actually see whether they're actually comfortable or not, because then we'll actually see the strikes happening or not. So for me, those were some of the big items that were basically part and parcel of the budget speech.
Another point to add is it will be interesting to see if this budget speech or the budget actually gets accepted. I think it's been, the DA has voiced that they're not supportive of the budget in its current format. So there's still quite a process to get through. I mean, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, I want to also throw in a point here that as we're going to focus, obviously, throughout this conversation on taxes. But the question for me is why, Vishal, from your point of view, would government still press ahead with the politically charged VAT, even though it may seem like a small amount, 0.5%? But, generally speaking, politically speaking, even in the social context of South Africa, many people would have thought that government will do away with the VAT increase and maybe find money somewhere.
Yeah, that's really surprising. I really don't understand why they've actually done that, because I mean, a higher VAT rate would only dampen household spending power, which is already weakened so significantly with regards to the high unemployment, rising interest rates, the slow wage growth rate, and this is actually going to hurt the economy. So from my perspective, I really don't understand. I know that he was actually trying to look for additional income or additional sources of income or revenue for the fiscus, but for me, it was definitely not supposed to be, it shouldn't have actually come through the VAT increase.
Yeah, and of course, when you get to issues about VAT, then people say, why do you have to tax the poor people more in order to subsidize that type of behavior in certain parts of the government? Let's come back to the tax matters again, Liz, that there is a generally held view in South Africa that we should charge more wealth tax than increasing VAT, that there was room to generate revenues from the wealth tax than from VAT.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was quite an interesting thought that we saw in the media before between the old budget, or we call it the old budget, and what we've seen yesterday. But essentially, the long and the short of it is that, unfortunately, we do not have enough wealth in South Africa to tax. That is the first problem with the wealth tax. Secondly, South Africa actually already has a number of wealth taxes. And we talk about them, Professor Deborah Tickle, she talks about them as stealth wealth taxes, which are in effect wealth taxes which you don't realize. We've got our dividends withholding tax, which is at 20%, which is higher than the global norm. We've got capital gains tax. We've got STT, so securities transfer tax, which is a form of a wealth tax. We've got transfer duty on the transfer of property. We've got municipal rates, which a lot of people don't realize is actually a form of wealth taxes as well, because it's based purely on the value of the property in which you own. We've got estate duty, transfer duty. Estate duty, transfer duties. There's a whole host, donations tax, of taxes already. And a wealth tax is really not the solution. If we look internationally, wealth taxes have been tried by many different countries. And if you look at the OECD report on wealth taxes, I think there was about 20 or 24 countries that tried to implement wealth taxes. but they are notoriously difficult and expensive to administer. So most countries actually end up scrapping them because they're expensive, they're difficult to administer, and they don't end up collecting a lot. So I don't think that we would or we should see a wealth tax in South Africa. It might have been a good idea in theory, but in reality, it's definitely not going
I
to.
suppose the question is, what is that tax going to be called? Because we've already mentioned
All these wealth taxes,
exactly.
yes.
So if you take them all together, then we may as well refer to them as that is what wealth tax is all
Yes.
about. Is that correct?
Yes, 100%.
Let's look at the number of individuals who are taxpayers in the country and look at the different brackets of these taxpayers. Which income taxpayers pay the most to the country's fiscus?
Yeah. So I don't have the exact stats on that, but what I do have is I recently read a report, the Afro-Asia report on wealth in South Africa, and it said that I think it was published in 2019 or 2020, around about there. So it is a little bit older, but in that report, it said there's 650 billion of private wealth sitting in individuals' names. Is private wealth. 650 billion is private wealth. Of all the taxpayers, there are only 40,000, just under 40,000 taxpayers, which have more than $1 million.
Okay, which would translate to 20 million,
20 million rand, yes.
More than 20 million.
Yes.
40,000 South Africans.
40,000 South Africans that have more than $1 million.
Right.
There are just under 2,000 individuals which have more than $10 million.
Yeah.
Now, that might sound a lot, but in terms of taxpayers and number of taxpayers, that's an incredibly small group of South Africans. Yeah. And that is a high net worth tax base that we have.
Sure.
And what was interesting is compared to the 2014 report, that those numbers had actually come down. So Afro-Asia had a 2014 report, they had a 2019 report, and those numbers came down. And that was likely as a result of immigration of the tax base out of South Africa, which is a big problem. I mean, we need to see. So the point is we can't tax our higher rate taxpayers even more. That's not a viable solution. They're already being squeezed quite significantly. I mean, I mentioned some of the taxes. There are a lot more taxes that they face. What we rather need to do is focus on this missing middle in South Africa. We need to grow our tax base so that there are more taxpayers to tax.
You call them missing middle. How do you define them?
So they essentially are middle income earners, not our higher rate taxpayers, not the people who have more than $1 million. It's your average man on the street earning a salary, working. You know, it's people who are working and earning a salary. Pay as you earn, I think that's a huge contribution towards our tax collection at the moment. In fact, I think it's where our biggest form of revenue comes from is PAYE, and we need to continue growing that base.
Sure. And Vishal, would you like to comment on this matter?
When it comes to taxes, and if you look at the tax creep, especially for the middle income earners, in the country, someone earning something like 500,000, if you take that into consideration, I really feel sorry for someone like that. Because if you look at what the increases are like, if you take, let's say, 6% increase, if they get a 6% increase, they're actually going to go over the threshold of the higher tax bracket. And on paper, it may seem as though they're getting a lot more money, but eventually what's going to end up happening is that they're going to have a lot less in their pockets simply because they've actually gone over the threshold. So it's for people like that, and I actually do feel sorry. Government should have actually been thinking about that. I mean, people like your teachers, your nurses, etc. These are people every day who are actually trying to actually make a good living. And unfortunately, it hasn't been, or it's not going to be actually beneficial for them, because they're actually going to end up losing a lot more than actually gaining anything from this budget speech. Thanks.
So in a way, if I understand you correctly, is that if you earn around the number that you've mentioned, you should forego your increase because you're going to pay more tax on it, isn't it? To me, it would be logical to do that.
Yeah, I would actually try to, if you're thinking of it like that, I would try to actually just be just under that threshold, so to speak. So if you're at the 500 mark where we're actually talking about, you just want to get 521,000 basically. You don't want to go a little bit more than that, because the moment you get more, you're going up into a higher tax bracket.
So what is the amount of money that one needs to earn to start being regarded as an income taxpayer? And I want to tie that up, Liz, with the pensioners. If there are any benefits to pensioners besides the increases that were mentioned in the budget that will be going to the pensioners, but those who make a little bit more money are likely to pay more tax, or they might be given some relief of sorts.
Yeah. I think our lowest tax bracket at the moment is sitting close to about 150,000 rand. If you above that level, then you start paying taxes. I mean, there's a whole table, and the biggest portion of the wealth in South Africa is currently sitting in retirement funds and retirement products, where there's currently no taxes, and rightly so. There shouldn't be. When you withdraw from the funds, then you will be facing taxes. There was no mention of that in the budget. I mean, there were people who were worried that a wealth tax could potentially be levied on retirement funds, which, as you know, we didn't see that coming in. So I think from a retirement perspective, there hasn't been any mention to changes of that. There has been the two-pot system that has been introduced, which enables South Africans to access money earlier before retirement, which might have some unintended consequences. And there's questions about whether or not that should have been done. I think it could have some unintended consequences, the new two-pot retirement system.
You mentioned something earlier about increasing the number of income tax payers, the missing middle, as you call them. What would be the better approach for that, you reckon? I mean, to increase that number?
Economic growth. That's what the government needs to focus on.
Yeah.
Economic growth. And I'm not an economist. I don't know how they need to achieve that, but that's the tough thing to achieve.
Do you share that sentiment, Vishal?
I definitely do. For me, if you look at the budget speech, it actually lacked a lot in terms of economic growth. The minister spoke a little about it, about job creation, but he never got into it. We need to actually look at industrial policies, manufacturing incentives. We need to look at sector-specific interventions in terms of agriculture, mining, tourism. And with regards to the limited focus on job creation, I mean, I know he's actually spoken a little bit about Operation Vulindlela, but there's no clear roadmap for large-scale employment creation in the country at this point in time. For me, he actually missed the ball a little bit. He should have actually spoken a little bit more on that. And that would have actually allayed a lot of fears, and they would have actually been a way forward with regards to actually increasing our tax base.
All right, let's conclude then. Here we are. We know how the tax setup is going to work going forward. Only 0.5% increase on VAT, which is still to be agreed to, may be rejected once the budget is put before Parliament. We don't know that, but we'll see what happens over the next few days. So when you look at the budget as is in its totality and the tax elements of it, are individuals and organizations or companies going to benefit anything out of this? Or would it contribute anything to the improved quality of life of South Africans? Liz?
We would hope so. I think that sentiment is quite positive in South Africa. It's cautiously optimistic at the moment. And I think that there's been a lot of thought that's gone into the budget. I think they're in a difficult situation. The VAT increase is always going to be a political hot potato that needs to be passed around. But I think there are also, from a foreign investment into this country, we can't forget about exchange control. I don't want to throw it in the last minute, but
please expand on it. Actually,
we have seen some significant relaxations in exchange controls, which has seen more and more foreign investors being prepared to invest into South Africa. So hopefully we'll start seeing the benefit of that coming through in the future years. So whilst I think the VAT increase is a political hot potato, the rest of the budget, as far as tax policies are concerned, was a good budget.
Thanks very much. And Vishal, your comments?
Yeah, my final verdict on the budget speech, the VAT increase is actually going to put a lot of strain on some of the consumers. But as you can see, the minister actually did try to soften it up a little bit by increasing social grants and basically taking into account additional items for the zero-rated food expansions. Balancing the social spending with the debt reduction is possible. It's a bit tricky though. The transition that we're actually making to more sustainable economy is actually very unclear. I would have actually appreciated him actually taking us into his confidence and speaking a little bit more about that, talking more boldly about our long-term strategies about manufacturing, green energy, SMEs. These are the things that I would have wanted him to have actually spoken to us about, but unfortunately he hasn't. And because of that, it's a little bit out there whether it was actually a really good budget speech or not. But definitely, it's going to hurt the consumers at the bottom end of the market. Thanks, Tim.
Vishal Patel, thank you very much for talking to us with the Auditor General of South Africa. We appreciate you being part of this podcast. And Liz Fick, thanks again for making time to talk to us. We
Pleasure.
appreciate your time. And as always, the Southern African auditors, government auditors, brings out this podcast to make sure that we hold each other accountable as well as promote transparency in the affairs of the country. And again, thank you for watching. Until next time.